Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1152. In this video, we will consider the United States in the years after the Second World War, from 1945 to about 1959. We will outline some of the most important events, trends, and people during this period, and we will consider life for everyday Americans as well. As the war came to an end in 1945, an economic recession began. Most economists think that the post-World War II recession of 1945 and 1946 was caused by a massive drop in the gross domestic product, about 13%, brought on by the conclusion of the U.S. government war contracts. With the war over, there was no need for the massive and expensive mobilization of the American people. As these contracts came to an end and big business struggled to return to the production of civilian goods, many jobs dried up, increasing unemployment, which had been almost non-existent during the war. The unemployment numbers increased dramatically as war veterans returned home and tried to enter the labor force. Many Americans were concerned that their nation would return to the economic privations of the Great Depression now that the war was over. To make matters worse, FDR, the architect of the New Deal, who had guided the nation through the Depression and the war, had died on April 12th, at the beginning of his fourth presidential term, leaving Harry S. Truman, FDR's VP, as commander-in-chief. Truman was a very different kind of politician than FDR, though. Where FDR was a refined, elite New Yorker, Truman came from a small town in Missouri and entered politics after serving in the First World War. Truman also had a rougher manner of speech than FDR, and occasionally cursed in public as well. Some thought Truman was not up to the challenge of being president, and he quickly surrounded himself with FDR's old supporters and set to work. He was successful enough to be re-elected in 1948. The recession of 1945-1946 ended quickly, thanks in part to the vast savings that everyday Americans had accrued during the war. As stated previously, wages had been high during the war, and there had been few things to spend on, so Americans were looking to paint the town red in the years after World War II. The cash infused into the economy helped big businesses retool to making consumer goods once again. Automakers that had made aircraft and tanks went back to making automobiles, and factories that had produced war materiel returned to making appliances and consumer goods. And farmers grew food to feed hungry domestic mouths as rationing came to an end. The economy rebounded quickly, and although there would be several more recessions in the 1940s and 1950s, this was a period of economic growth for the most part, and optimism about the nation's economy. Americans had come together to fight the Axis powers during World War II, but now they would have to face their former ally, the Soviet Union, as an enemy. The two world powers had made common cause after Nazi Germany had invaded the USSR in 1941, but relations had soured since 1945. Even during the war, the USSR and the Western Allies disagreed over how post-war Europe should be managed. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had wanted to maintain partial control of the nations that the Russian Red Army had liberated from the Nazis. Stalin wanted to establish communist governments in these countries and either absorb them into the USSR or rule by proxy, transforming them into communist buffer states to protect Soviet Russia from future Western invasions. The Russian experience during the war had been brutal, with at least 26 million casualties, civilian and military, sustained during the fighting. Stalin wanted to avoid repeats of such deaths, and he desired to spread communism to the countries that were now occupied by Soviet troops as well. The Soviet and Western governments also disagreed over what to do with the defeated Germany. Because Russia had suffered so much at the hands of the Germans, Stalin and many other Soviet leaders wanted to see Germany punished severely, beyond just holding the members of the Nazi high command accountable for their crimes against humanity. The Soviets favored deindustrialization of Germany and the transformation of the German state into a weak, agricultural, pastoral nation with few weapons and almost no industrial capacity. This approach to the reconstruction of Germany was called the Morgenthau Plan. The Western Allies, however, did not want to punish Germany as severely. The US, Britain, and eventually France recognized how the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles had contributed to the Second World War, and were inclined to support a lighter rebuilding plan to avoid a repeat World War. The Western Allies, including President Truman, were concerned about the territorial gains that the Soviet Union had made during the Second World War, and they worried about the spread of communism, assuming that countries with communist governments would likely become allies with the Soviets. This was the Truman Doctrine: keep the Soviet Union and communism from expanding. Much of Truman's thinking was informed by the strategy of containment, as developed by American foreign policy expert George Kennan. Kennan had lived and worked in the Soviet Union during the Second World War and was considered by many to be an expert on Soviet thinking. He argued in his magnum opus, The Long Telegram, that the US had to be aggressive with the Soviet Union to prevent the spread of communism. By 1947, Kennan's approaches had become common among Western, so-called First World politicians, who did not want to see the Soviet Union become too powerful or see communism spread to their own countries. These policymakers certainly did not want to see communism become popular in a defeated Germany, the way Nazism had become popular in the years after World War I. To this end, President Truman supported the Marshall Plan. Named after U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall, the Marshall Plan called for U.S. government spending to rebuild Europe. Truman, Marshall, and others reasoned that bringing prosperity back to Europe would prevent the spread of communism, and Western Europe entering the Soviet sphere of influence, the so-called Second World. All in all, the U.S. spent about $12 billion, about $128 billion in today's money. Most of the money went to Britain and France and other Western European countries, but about 11% went to rebuilding West Germany, which was still occupied by the Allies, while the Soviets occupied all of the German territory they had captured in the war, East Germany. The Soviets refused Western aid and prevented their satellite states, the Eastern Bloc, from receiving money from the West. The plan was active from 1948 to 1951. Scholars debate how effective the Marshall Plan was in rebuilding Europe, but they agree that the gesture of aid certainly helped keep Western Europe from joining the Eastern Bloc and embracing communism. In 1948, as relations between the US, its allies, and the Soviets continued to deteriorate, the Soviets sponsored a communist coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia and blockaded Berlin. Berlin was the former German capital, and it remained the capital of East Germany, in what would be called the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. Although Berlin was deep in Eastern Bloc territory, the Allies had occupation zones within the city. The Soviet military blocked all supply trains into Berlin, attempting to starve the Allies out. The Allies, Britain, France, and the US, responded by blockading East Germany. The Allies also flew supply planes into Berlin, bringing food and supplies to the Allied zones of the city. The Berlin airlift is considered by many to be the official beginning of the Cold War. Even though the Soviets did not fire on the Allied planes, it marked the beginning of the militarization and separation of Allied Western and Soviet Eastern Europe, the so-called Iron Curtain. The airlift was a success, keeping the Allied occupation zones supplied, and the deliveries endeared Berliners to the Allies and helped turn many of them against the Soviets. The operation would continue until 1949, and the Soviets once again allowed Western allies to supply Allied Berlin by ground. The successes of the Berlin airlift, in part, helped the embattled President Truman win the 1948 presidential election against the Republican Thomas Dewey, even though the Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond cost Truman votes in the South. The Cold War intensified in 1950 with the beginning of the Korean War. With the Soviet entrance into the Pacific Theater and the defeat of Japan, the Korean Peninsula, a Japanese territory since shortly after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, was divided along the 38th Northern Parallel. The Soviets would administer the North until 1948, and the Western Allies would run the South until 1949. Since the end of World War II, communists under Mao Zedong had taken control of China by 1949. North Koreans had played a part in the creation of the Communist People's Republic of China and had sponsored a communist insurgency in the south as well of Korea. With the permission of Stalin and the backing of China, the North Korean army under Kim Il-sung crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950. North Korean troops quickly overwhelmed South Korean forces and had captured almost all of the peninsula by September. In response to the invasion, the U.S., with the blessing of the United Nations, sent troops to Korea in July. Although pushed back initially, U.S. and UN troops soon gained the upper hand and forced the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel and then continued their advance into North Korea, gaining control of almost all of the peninsula by the end of 1950. General Douglas MacArthur, of World War II fame, wanted to continue the advance into China and defeat communist Chinese forces stationed near the peninsula. MacArthur thought that China was preparing to invade the Korean peninsula. MacArthur was removed from command by President Truman, allegedly for being too aggressive. China eventually invaded North Korea, and with air support from the Soviet Union, began to push UN forces back to about the 38th parallel. The war quickly degenerated into a stalemate, and an armistice in July of 1953 brought the war to an end and established the current borders of North and South Korea that we know today. During the Korean War, many American policymakers were concerned that the conflict would escalate into a full nuclear war. Although the U.S. had been the first nation to develop nuclear weapons, using fission-based atomic bombs, the Soviets had also developed their own atomic bombs by 1949, thanks in part to plans provided by spies. The Soviets had also developed fusion-based hydrogen thermonuclear bombs, which they had been working on since the late 1940s. The Soviets did not successfully test this type of bomb until 1953. The Soviet adoption of nuclear bombs changed the nature of the Cold War. It assured that the United States and its allies would not directly fight the Soviet Union and its partners, because both sides now had the technology to completely destroy each other. The belief that the Cold War would never escalate as long as both the First and the Second World had an equal number of nuclear weapons was called mutually assured destruction. Total wars in which the U.S. and its allies and the Soviets and its allies targeted each other's militaries and economies would quickly escalate into nuclear war. Thus, both nations would have to find more subtle, clandestine ways to fight each other. While the Korean War raged in Asia, a battle against alleged communist subversion seethed in the United States. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, presided over a massive Red Scare within the United States. McCarthy assured the American public that Soviet communists had infiltrated American political and cultural institutions, and McCarthy promised to ferret out these traitors and subversives. McCarthy, the FBI, with its director J. Edgar Hoover, and the new House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, investigated Americans who had been accused of supporting the communists. American intelligence operatives knew that there were Soviet spies and communists who wanted to weaken the country, i.e. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, spies who passed nuclear secrets to the USSR, and the Communist Party of the USA, which took funding from the USSR. But McCarthy's accusations were often unfounded, fabricated evidence, and targeted his political opponents. Americans from a variety of political backgrounds came out to condemn the excesses of McCarthy's accusations, and McCarthyism lost steam by the mid-1950s, although investigations by HUAC would continue. While scholars of all political perspectives have debated the level of communist infiltration of American society during the Cold War, most agree that McCarthy's investigation of supposed communists was excessive and bore elements of a witch hunt, because McCarthy frequently made accusations without evidence or false evidence, hoping to get people to confess to being communist or betray others. To this day, the term McCarthyism is still used to describe an unfounded and politically motivated accusation. While McCarthyism came to an end by the mid-50s, the anxiety over communist subversion that it created helped to inspire the so-called Lavender Scare, in which U.S. government began a large-scale discrimination against gay and lesbian government employees. The Lavender Scare entailed the investigation and dismissal of lesbian and gay government employees, and was part of the anti-communist movement that had grown since the beginning of the Cold War and the actions of the McCarthyites. It should also be noted that two of the most important people to advance the Lavender Scare, Roy Cohn and J. Edgar Hoover, were themselves both accused of engaging in homosexuality, demonstrating the rampancy of homophobia during the Cold War. While the Cold War was occasionally hot, as seen during the Korean War and later conflicts like the war in Vietnam, the Cold War would also be a war of ideas, especially those surrounding politics, economics, and culture. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a respected World War II five-star general and war hero, ran for president as a Republican in 1952, and again in 1956, partially on the promise that he would use his military experience to guide American politics, economics, and culture. Eisenhower promised to bring an end to the Korean War, but also to make every citizen a soldier in their occupation. Eisenhower believed that the best way the United States could defeat the Soviet Union came not from winning military conflicts, but from winning the war on the home front by growing American economic prosperity and spreading American capitalist and liberal democratic values across the world. He attacked the Truman administration and the Democrats for their handling of Korea, as well as for government corruption, and he won commandingly in 1952 and again in the 1956 election as well. Politically, Eisenhower referred to himself as a progressive conservative. He kept most of FDR's New Deal programs going, which had been important institutions in American life, and looked to consolidate and reform them as well. Ike also saw the complete desegregation of the U.S. military, a project that Truman had begun. He also oversaw the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and then 1960. Additionally, he ordered the deployment of National Guard and federal troops to desegregate schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, in line with the 1956 Brown versus Board of Education case. Eisenhower believed that civil rights for African Americans was an important national security issue, and Ike did not want the Soviet Union or American communists to condemn the country for its race relations. In public, Eisenhower called for African American civil rights, although he revealed his reluctance on the issue in his private life. Conversely, though, the deportation of illegal immigrants, primarily from Mexico, increased during the Eisenhower years, culminating in Operation Wetback in 1954. Wetback had long been a slur used for illegal immigrants from Mexico, and Mexican Americans as a whole, who had supposedly soaked their clothes while swimming across the Rio Grande and into the United States. After 1954, the deportation slowed, but they would increase again in the 1960s and 1970s. In addition, President Eisenhower signed an executive order barring lesbian and gay people from working for the U.S. government, continuing the Lavender Scare that had begun during the Truman years. In the end, Eisenhower was a complex political figure who supported a variety of politics from both the political right and left. Eisenhower, while being conflicted on social issues, unilaterally supported American technological development. Ike pushed for the creation of an interstate highway system so that American troops and materiel could be easily moved throughout the United States in 1956. The interstate highways could also be used by American civilian motorists, using the new cars they had purchased since the end of World War II. Ike also encouraged the United States to explore space exploration, seeing it as an important part of the technological Cold War against the USSR. After the Soviets launched their first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, Eisenhower authorized the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. While Eisenhower had called for peace on the Korean Peninsula and hoped for nuclear disarmament, he was much more alarmed about the expansion of communism in Southeast Asia and believed that if Vietnam, formerly French Indochina, became communist, then the rest of Southeast Asia would fall to communism as well. This belief would later be called Domino Theory. He also believed that Domino Theory applied in Latin America as well, leading to the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA's, numerous interventions in Latin American politics in the 20th century. Eisenhower also made a lot of mistakes in his campaigning for Richard Nixon, his former VP, in the 1960 presidential election, and probably contributed to the factors that caused Nixon to lose to John F. Kennedy. While some of Eisenhower's policies have been criticized to this day, Eisenhower is considered by Americans and historians from a variety of perspectives to be a successful president. He stabilized the Cold War, ended the conflict in Korea, fought for African American civil rights, and encouraged technological developments in order to preserve American cultural and economic fronts during the Cold War, even if some of the other policies during his tenure have not aged as well. Eisenhower also gave Americans some critical advice in his farewell address. He cautioned Americans to beware of the military-industrial complex, deficit spending on weapons and defense, and that such unsustainable and militaristic projects were contrary to the American principles of freedom and democracy. Now that we've talked about the major political figures and developments in the United States during the Cold War, we should consider how these policies manifest in the lives of everyday Americans in the 1950s. During the early Cold War, Americans were encouraged by their government to fight communism and embrace capitalism and American culture. While Americans had been forced to sacrifice during the Depression and World War II and save their money, now Americans were supposed to spend their money, buy consumer goods, and expand the economy through consumption. Americans bought new cars, new homes, and adopted new clothing styles. Returning veterans took advantage of the GI Bill in order to pursue higher education for free, although African Americans were often denied the benefits of this act, since disbursement of GI Bill funds were decided by local, usually white, committees. Despite this, about 49% of returning veterans used the GI Bill to go to college. The GI Bill was significant because it made higher education, which had previously been dominated by the elite, attainable for veterans of all economic classes, paving the way for large-scale university attendance among middle-class Americans. The GI Bill helped American veterans go to college, but it also helped many become homeowners as well. Homeownership has long been a goal for everyday Americans, and the U.S. government has long encouraged Americans to own their own real estate, going back to the Homestead Act of 1862, which we talked about in a previous video. The influx of home buyers created a need for additional single-family homes, leading to the growth of the suburbs, residential areas outside of cities. The growth of suburbs was facilitated by the GI Bill, but the proliferation of automobiles also helped the suburbs grow, as Americans could now live further away from their jobs and drive to work, often on interstate highways. Communities like Levittown, New York, on Long Island were considered to be model suburban communities. Demographically, the suburbs tended to be mostly white, as other minority groups, African Americans in particular, struggled to gain access to the loans that made purchasing suburban homes possible. Despite this, the suburbs were alluring to Americans from all backgrounds. The suburbs offered ordinary American families a chance to have the so-called American dream: homeownership, a small plot of land on which they could grow plants and pursue recreation. Suburban homes were miniature homesteads, appealing to the deep-seated American value of land ownership, which had persisted to at least the days of Thomas Jefferson. The suburbs were also more private, appealing to the American white middle class's desire for privacy and residency based around nuclear family units, which had been popular since the early 19th century. Many people of color also aspired to these middle-class values, but they were often prevented from attaining them because they were denied home loans. Now that we've talked about how everyday Americans advanced themselves economically during the Cold War years, let's consider their day-to-day lives. Americans enjoyed many new technologies during the 1950s as a result of technological innovations during the Second World War and the wealth they had saved as a result of war work. Americans bought refrigerators with built-in freezers and sleek electric stoves to make cooking and homemaking easier for women who were dropping out of the workforce and becoming housewives. Flash freezing, created by Clarence Birdseye, made frozen foods more affordable and common as well, allowing housewives to prepare meals for their families more quickly and easily. Televisions, which had been invented in the 1930s, became cheaper and more efficient after World War II. Americans used their savings to buy TVs, and by 1962, 90% of American households had their own set. The Hoover Vacuum Company offered its inexpensive Model 29 vacuum, which they sold to housewives through in-home demonstrations. Indeed, many of the new products that were available in the 1950s were marketed to women, especially middle-class homemakers. These new technologies promised to make women's housework easier, to free them from the drudgery of homemaking so that they could have more free time. In many ways, though, these new technologies raised the bar on the amount of housework homemaking women were expected to do. In addition, many working-class women were not able to fully enjoy these technologies, since they were too busy working outside of the home, or they simply could not afford them. On July 24, 1959, U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon showed Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev around a model home display at the American National Exhibition in Moscow. The interaction, which was filmed, featured Nixon demonstrating the use of American-made labor-saving and entertainment devices brought about by capitalism. The meeting, called the Kitchen Debate, featured Nixon extolling the benefits of American capitalism in a friendly, almost cloying manner. Khrushchev admired all of the goods and questioned why the U.S. needed to offer so many options to consumers. The Soviet Union, Khrushchev argued, offered its people fewer choices, but put its efforts into big, centrally planned projects like its space program. Nixon's interactions with Khrushchev were filmed and later broadcast in both the U.S. and the USSR. The kitchen debate made Nixon very popular in the U.S. and bolstered his campaign for president in 1960. The interaction also convinced Khrushchev that he should do everything he could to keep Nixon from winning the presidency. The 1950s was a time of great political change and technological advancement, thanks in part to the pressures of the Cold War. Americans in the 1950s would also begin to view youth and childhood differently as well. After the Second World War, the U.S. witnessed a massive increase in the birth rate, thanks in part to the return of male veterans and because the period's economic prosperity made having children more practical. This new generation, which would come to be known as the baby boomers, would encompass people born from 1946 to 1964. Over 76 million boomers were born during this period, making the largest generation in U.S. history. The boomers were born after World War II, and they did not experience the privations of the Great Depression or the Second World War. The economy was generally good during their childhood and adolescence, and although they did not live in light of the Cold War and the threat of mutually assured destruction, boomers grew up with TV and radio and had products that were marketed specifically towards them, and generally were able to enjoy their youth. The boomers adopted new, less formal clothing styles, making youthfulness, rather than elegance, the sartorial goal. Boomer males wore denim dungarees, blue jeans, which had previously been considered workwear. Denim had become associated with masculinity during the Second World War, as sailors and industrial workers wore jeans. Young men who wanted to prove their strength and vitality began to wear jeans in increasing numbers. Young women also began to adopt less formal styles. Women popularized short, flared, schoolgirl-style skirts that were often adorned with applique dogs and were nicknamed poodle skirts. Young women showed off their new styles at soda fountains, diners, and after-school parties, and young people together created a teenager culture. Young people also played sports, raced automobiles, danced, and listened to rock and roll music, creating subcultures for these activities. While young people have always sought to differentiate themselves from their parents, businesses and marketers really tried to teach the young boomers and sell them products that spoke to the growing generation gap. These products were usually marketed to white adolescents, but corporations also tried to reach out to minority youth in advertising as well. While Americans were encouraged to be optimistic about capitalism and their nation's future, many people were also concerned about the direction in which the country was going. As always is the case, parents worried about their children's future, and while parents recognized that their kids had more economic opportunities than they had, many of them thought the new products and styles that were available and the economic prosperity their children experienced were dubious. Some worried that young boomers were too weak and too focused on pleasure and instant gratification. They also thought that boomers had not really suffered in their lives and needed to build character through adversity. Boomers had not survived the Great Depression or fought in a world war as they had. They also feared that the comforts that young people enjoyed were playing right into the desire of the Soviet Union and the communists who wanted to weaken America. Generational anxiety is evident in the films made during the 1950s. For example, Westerns were popular during this period. Westerns spoke to older Americans who longed for a simpler, rougher, long-gone time where men were men, women were women, and the biggest problems America faced came from winning the West, which was a far more complicated process than the film showed, as we discussed in a previous video. Actors like John Wayne and Gary Cooper embodied the masculine American cowboy ideal. War movies were also popular for similar reasons. The film that perhaps best exemplifies the generation gap between the boomers and their parents was the 1955 picture Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean. In the film, Dean portrayed a naive but rebellious teenager who is estranged from his father and falls in with a bad crowd. The film's message is that young people are aimless and rebellious and need strong but understanding guidance from older people if they are to succeed and become adults. The film was a massive success, not just because Dean had been killed in a car accident before it was released, but also because it spoke to both young boomers and their parents. Films in the 1950s revealed the undercurrents of social anxiety that many Americans were feeling as a result of the generation gap. The Red and the Lavender Scares, changing race relations, and the growing gulf between the baby boomers and their parents. In the end, the 1950s was a dynamic period of great political, social, and technological change. Americans were encouraged by their government to live life to the fullest, to demonstrate the merits of liberal democracy and capitalism. Americans were also encouraged to unite against the threat of communism, even if this galvanization entailed discrimination against some of their fellow Americans. The period was generally optimistic, in spite of the Cold War and the threat of mutually assured destruction, but there were cracks in the picture window that would grow and lead to the shattering of American optimism in later years. But that is a discussion for future videos.